Good afternoon, it's Lee Cassidy from Tactile Technology with our regular Enterprise Wednesday conversation where we talk about anything that would be really important for an enterprise organisation. Today we're going to be talking about a slightly different view of doing data protection, so backup and recovery and also disaster recovery as a service rather than actually buying software or buying hardware infrastructure or appliances to do it. So I've got Stewart Parkin from ADP, Advanced Data Protection, with us. So I'll just bring Stu in. How are you doing, Stu?
Yeah, very well, thanks, Lee. Great to be here. Thanks, Harry.
So, a lot of people in the past, especially many years ago, would have, tape silos. They'd have very expensive software and hardware infrastructure, multiple nodes to be able to do the capacity for large sites for data backup and things. But, gradually that's changed a lot. And a lot of people now are using, say virtualized products, software products that sit within their infrastructure, especially if it's, something like Hyper-V or a virtualized environment like VMware. But also, there are a number of products that have come out that are effectively like an HCI version of backup and recovery, such as Rubrik, which is, how, the solution we're going to talk about today is built on. Plus, there are other alternatives out there as well. But there must be some issues around going down that route. One is financially having to buy the assets and run them, but there's also the operational side of things as well. So what do you think the key benefits of going to more of a as a service route rather than doing it yourself?
I think one of the big things that we've seen is the ability to flex both up and down. Okay, so not just make that capital purchase and be fixed to that the amount of data storage that gives you, or the compute aspect that gives you. Being able to consume in an almost a cloud-based manner of a per terabyte per month or per terabyte per year basis really has given the flexibility in the market of, like you say, with the tape silos, you've had a fixed capacity, right? And with storage arrays, you've got a fixed capacity that you can use. Being able to,
I think that's always been a challenge for organisations to actually predict what capacity they need to make sure it's in place, because it's often difficult to understand what your effective retention period is and how much data is going to be there, but also factoring the growth of the organisation as well, because especially as we've seen a lot more data that's not compressible, we're storing a lot more data as well. So it can be a challenge, can't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the nature of organizations in this day and age is actually a lot of organizations are growing through M&A, through mergers and acquisitions. So they don't necessarily know what data lives on the other side of that acquisition. So having the ability to quickly bring on 100, 200, 300 terabytes or 10, 20, 30 terabytes is really key for them from a financial and budgetary perspective.
So if we go back to the cloud piece you talked about before, one of the key things that people move towards cloud is that they don't have to go through the process of procurement. So they don't have to specify what they want to do and how they're going to do it. They don't have to then go out and actually tender or go through a procurement exercise to buy it. Then they don't have to then 18 months later start that process again so that they're ready to go for the end of their 3-year period. Plus also, the ability to flex inside it, whether that's short term or whether it's a long term or it's a gradual increase in capacity, has always been a thing for the traditional cloud piece anyway, for compute and storage. But I'm assuming, like you've said, that a lot of those things are naturally the same for something like this, a backup and recovery service.
Yeah, absolutely. Having the ability to bring on or spin up a new application within your environment would usually mean that you'd have to go through a complete procurement process to buy additional capacity, to buy, if you've got a disaster recovery center or a second DC, you'd have to buy that twice. Whereas with consuming this as a service, both backup and disaster recovery, you can quickly scale up, you immediately scale that up and have your protection both on and off site.
And what I've noticed as well over the years, people used to have a traditional backup site, didn't they? That they would back everything to, they sort of replicate from the storage, or using some form of software replication to get all the data there, and it would sit idle. Yeah, but it would actually mean that you bought twice as much infrastructure you need, so that when you get to the point in time that you do need it, you can fire it up. Yeah, and that was one of the issues, I think, of the old way of doing it. I think the other thing is people started to go towards more an active piece. But I think when you're going down that active route, you've got to be cautious about how much capacity you buy, because you end up in the same boat, that you end up with twice as much as you need, but you're actually utilizing both sites now. So what you have to do then is think about, what do I really need if I actually go into a recovery time frame? If I do recover, what's my bare minimum to be able to run the business on? And I think that's a challenge for a lot of organizations, because sometimes they need everything. So there's no real benefit of going to this active environment, really, because once you go over, you've only got half your capacity, because you've lost one of the sites already anyway, haven't you? Do you think that's driving a lot more people down this DR as a service, utilizing public cloud infrastructure or private cloud infrastructure as well?
Yeah, we're finding an awful lot of organizations are reassessing exactly what they need in a DR. They've come from that traditional, we've got our second office has got a data center in the cloakroom.
Yeah.
Or we've got a really expensive Sun Data Guard environment with something that we bought 7 years ago. It was the old production environment. We've moved it to the DR site, and we know that if we ever had to invoke disaster recovery, it wouldn't be up to spec. It probably wouldn't run the operating systems that we have now. Yeah. But the other thing that people have become really interested in taking disaster recovery as a service is both the automation and the testing. So being able to procure it as a service, you not get the expandable and instant spin up of the environment, and not having to worry about having enough capacity, because the service provider takes care of that. But they also take care of the testing. So they do that laborious recovery of all the servers, restore. With Rubrik, it's obviously much simpler, and with other technologies now we can live mount and we can spin things up much quicker. But there's still a process that has to be gone through, spinning that up, creating the automated scripts, spinning up networks, working out how those users are going to connect into that environment. And we can take that headache away from them, so that there's not that dreaded week before the test where everybody's trying to work out whether they can be off next week with a cold, or, that dreaded DR week is taken away from them, and it actually becomes as pleasant an experience as a DR test can be, but it's something they don't have to worry about or plan for.
Yeah, because if you think about it, having to do, because some people it needs to be done every 6 months, some people annually. Doing a DR test is actually quite a cost to the organisation in manpower, in preparation, but also if you're using on-site infrastructure, there's going to be an impact on the actual operational infrastructure through either changes that you're doing to make sure that you've got access to the DR environment, but also reduction in certain capacity, especially if you don't have 100%, a copy of your capacity in a second site that you can utilize, which most people don't these days. So there's always going to be an impact, isn't there, on that testing?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just about when you do the test, it's how you then react to that test if it's gone wrong. So if something doesn't quite come back, do you ever get round to fixing it? Or are you just crossing the fingers that it will be all right on the night, so to speak? So I think certainly having the reassurance that somebody else is taking care of it, somebody with experience and has probably seen this thing 100 times before, it gives you the reassurance that actually we can recover. And if the worst does happen, we can get everything back. And that's really reassuring for a lot of people.
I think the other thing is when you look at these things, if you look at traditional cloud infrastructure, say AWS, GCP, Azure, when you're taking those services, you're taking infrastructure or platform as a service, aren't you? With a backup and recovery or a DR as a service, you're not just getting effectively the infrastructure to deliver it. You're also getting the skills and experience of the organization to be able to plan it and design it to meet the needs of the organization, but also to go through the operational aspects to make sure that the backups are done correctly, make sure that we've got correct reporting if there are issues, identifying where the issues are and resolving those issues, but also if there is either a live or a test invocation, that all that goes through and everything's tested fully and we make sure it works correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a really, really key point and a key sales point for us as a managed service provider. You know, we have the experience. The guys in our DR team have got in excess of 150 years of DR experience. And I think it's a lot with computers. If you're not, or with anything really, if you're not doing it every day, you get rusty. So if you're doing a test once a year, if you haven't got the proper documentation in place, or you haven't got someone with a photographic memory, it's going to take, the same mistakes will crop up time and time again, and people will go, oh yeah, that happened last year, we did this. But if you've got that documented, if you've got somebody who knows exactly how to fix it on hand, or similarly fixes it before the occurrence, you know, it's just a complete weight off your shoulders and peace of mind again, that should the worst happen, you get back quickly and correctly. You know, it's all very well having backups, but if you don't know they can come be restored, they're useless. You know, they're an expensive paperweight. So it's
and I think, you know, we've just talked about the skills within the backup as a service capability. If you go back to the traditional world of doing it yourself, a lot of times people don't have specialist roles nowadays. You know, people are becoming more generalists, so they cover a lot of different areas. So we don't have the guy who looks after the storage, and one looks after the network, one looks after compute, and somebody who does the backup and recovery. Most people are generalists now, and they got a bit of knowledge about everything, but not very deep. And I think that's then a challenge when you do get to the point where you need to do something for real. A couple of things to think about, though, is recoveries aren't always a complete disaster and recover everything. There are little bits between that, aren't there? So, you know, there might be where an individual user is either accidentally deleted or needs a copy that's been modified of a particular document, you know, especially if it's something like legal, it needs to be a particular point in time. We also have people who need, you know, a variety of data from maybe a database like a SQL database as well at a point in time for a particular application, and not all of it, you know, just that one application's database. You know, so there are a number of times when, you know, it's actually just a small amount of capacity needs to be recovered, and I think that's where this fits really well as well, especially using, you know, the Rubrik technology underneath it. I think that makes a big difference, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Disasters happen in every sort of scenario that you can think of. It could be complete building failure. It could be denial of access to the building. But just as important is the files and folders themselves. You know, the adage that's always talked about is what happens if payroll goes down at the end of the month. You know, that's as important, or that's as critical as a complete site disaster in the middle of the month. You know, nobody gets paid, nobody turns up to work. If the suppliers don't get paid, the lights go off. You know, it's not necessarily the size, but the criticality of that data. And like you said, the Rubrik and the modern way of bringing things back is both granular and quick. It really is quick. And I think building on top of that, not just disasters or not just file recoveries or encryptions, and we'll not go on to ransomware at this point because we could be on all afternoon, but things things like being more versatile with your backup data. So using that data for things like compliance or auditing purposes. So bringing back your HR database for audit purposes from last month instantly, so that you don't have to waste resources or storage capacity to show a copy of that data that you brought back in a segregated environment. So you can provide that to your external audit company. So there's not just disasters and recovery that we do and that we can help with. It's utilizing that data so that it's more useful and not just there as an insurance policy.
Yeah, I would say a lot of people, just look at it in that respect. But compliance, I think, is becoming more and more important, and also managing risk. And I think that's becoming a really important thing that people are looking at. So if anybody's going down the ISO 27001, or they've actually got other areas like 9000 in their business around manufacturing or something like that, they need to have the data protection of their real-time data and historic data with their computing environment a part of that. And I think it's quite important that they do that. And I think also there's really an importance around protecting data in those more compliant environments like PCI or equivalent of HIPAA in patient records and things as well, where we need to really be careful about who accesses, but also being able to recover that data in the future if there's been any loss. So there's a lot of areas that we're thinking differently about the way we do things nowadays as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that what's often forgotten is data backups are a carbon copy of your production environment at that point in time. So if you don't want somebody to see it on your production environment, then it's vital that they don't also have a backdoor via the backups. Yeah. So you see an awful lot of organizations now who actually the most important person in the organization was the storage and backup guy, because he had complete access to the production storage and complete access to your backups. So if he was a bad actor and had access to both areas of the business, he could quite easily delete something he didn't want you to see out of both locations. Yeah. And we're seeing more and more air gaps between the backup and storage teams within the industry, within organizations, because of that that threat to them.
Yeah, and there are other things to consider as well, because we know from what we read in and also what we see with customers around. You mentioned ransomware attacks, where people are going in and intentionally encrypting data. What we're seeing is a lot of organisations now, the first thing that's attacked is their data protection infrastructure. So they're looking to either find a software based and encrypt all the snapshots, or find a hardware-based device and try and reset it if they can, factory reset it so it wipes all of those backups. So there's nothing to recover to. And I think one thing that going down the route of a backup as a service offering is that's not an issue, because it's inherent in the design of and deployment of the infrastructure to protect that environment, that can't happen. So you're always protected against any of those kind of attacks as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Rubric calls it immutable storage. Having that, whether it's logical or physical, air-gapped copy of your data is absolutely essential in this day and age. The attacks are becoming more and more sophisticated as hours pass. Like you say, an awful lot of vendors have been caught out by this, and vendor setups have been caught out by this, where they've encrypted the data, but they've also encrypted the backups. So you can't restore from encrypted backups. So having that air-gapped and immutable solutions are just so important. Whether it be immutable file systems or worm file systems, or a physical air-gapped system in the cloud or off-prem, it's just so important to make sure that you have that protection within your data protection environment.
So coming back to the way we would put something together and deploy it. So, we'd commonly put some equipment on the customer's site that would actually do local backup. So that could be either a software version of the Rubrik platform running in a virtualized environment for smaller sites. For larger sites, we would actually use the standard Rubrik infrastructure and then replicate that data back to the data center, or with other options of actually putting it to two different data centers to give them two extra copies as well as the local copy that's on site. And then finally, we can also add in additionally the DR as a service capability on top of that, where we give effective capacity for them to spin up those virtual machines in a DR restoration point.
Yeah, the possibilities are almost endless, to be perfectly honestly. The critical thing whenever you're designing a data recovery solution is that you start almost from the most important thing, which is what are your recovery time objectives and what are your recovery point objectives?
Yeah,
both local and remote, and that will dictate really how you implement and architect a backup and recovery solution. So can you send your data into the cloud? Can you send it to a third-party provider? Do you need localized recovery? What are your internet connectivity? What's your internet connectivity like? What's the inter-site connectivity like? All of these factors play an exacting role in the architecture of a backup and recovery solution. So I think a lot of mistakes are made in the early design phase. If you jump straight into, right, we have got X, Y, and Z technologies and we need to back them all up and we need them instantly recoverable. And then all of a sudden the finance team come in and go, that's far too expensive. We need to make cutbacks. If you design it properly and have that in mind of these are the RTOs, these are the RPOs, and we have to meet those, then as we work through the design and implementation phases, we can make sure that if the finance team do come in or procurement do come in and say this is too expensive, there are trade-offs made. So we're constantly reverting back to, well, 3 months ago, you told us that you needed instant recovery in Singapore for 40 terabytes of data.
Yeah.
So we often have to re-architect things because of procurement and finances, but we have to ensure that you are constantly referring back to the most critical point of any backup and recovery solution, which are the RTOs and RPOs, because that's what the business needs.
I think the other thing that we always have to be conscious of as well is retention periods, because a lot of people seem to think you've just got to have everything retained for the same length of time, depending on what industry you're in. So if it's financial services, commonly people think of 7 years, but it isn't really. It's only the data that matters needs to be retained for that period of time. There'll be a lot of components in there that don't need to be retained over that period of time. So that can save a lot in that design piece to ensure that you're only retaining the data that needs to be retained for that longer period, and also then just retaining for a shorter period things that need to be available but don't need to be long-term available.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Lee. And we see two approaches to this, actually. So there's two schools of thought here. One is my backup is also my retention tool. I will keep everything forever. I'll keep everything for 7 years. The FSA dictate that everything must be retained for 7 years, so I must keep the door entry system for 7 years. Stupid things like that, which goes to your point about being more granular and being more consultative as a service provider and saying, right, do you need your door entry system from 7 years ago? Or do you need payroll from 7 years ago? What parts of the business require that 7-year retention period? Yeah. And once you've taken a step back, you actually realize that it's probably only 10% of my environment needs to be kept for 7 years or 10 years or 5 years, and we can actually be more economical and more efficient. The other school of thought is actually a backup is a backup and it's for recovery, not for archive. Yeah. Backup is a very expensive archive. So if you have solutions in place to archive files, to make sure you've got a proper file archive or email archive, then actually your backup retention can be quite short.
Yeah.
And there's a huge school of thought, and I'm sure we could spend many hours discussing the pros and cons to each of them. But we have customers that do both. So we have customers who use things like Azure, things like AWS, S3 compatible storage to keep an archive of their data, because again, they're reutilizing backups. They don't have to worry about having an archive solution. They don't have to worry about stubbing files and moving things around. It's just the easy way to do it.
Yeah.
But we also have organizations who appreciate that it's an expensive way. It can be, an expensive way to keep data in almost indefinitely in some instances. And there is definitely the opinion of what will happen in 10 years' time within technology. They've got, many organizations will have tapes that don't have a tape loader compatible anymore.
One thing as well to think about is that because your backup recovery data now is being brought to a single point, not only a single point, but also gives you effectively a master view of all your information, all your data. So, the business analytics that you can go against, that gives you a real strength as well to understand what's happening and what's where. But we're running out of time. So, what would you say that they're like the key three things of going down a backup or a DR as a service route, rather than doing the traditional capital purchase of equipment and software and doing it yourself? Because we're running out of time at the moment. What would you say the top three things are that people would benefit taking a service rather than doing it themselves?
Operational versus capex expenditure. The market, especially since COVID and the situation that we're in, we've seen a definite move towards OPEX spend as a service. It makes it really, really easy to move to that model.
Yeah.
Flexibility will be the second. Being able, as we spoke right at the start, being able to flex both up and down without having to worry about sweating assets and the lifespan of the assets themselves. And third, which is we spent quite a lot of time on as well, is skills.
Yeah.
So being able to take advantage of the skills that the managed service provider have, especially from specialists like ourselves, who this is all we do. We are a backup and recovery specialist. We have guys who spend all day looking at backup failures and resolving backup failures. And as dull as that is, that's what they do, and that's what they're great at. Recovery specialists, that's what they do, that's what they're great at. And you can, without having to buy in these resources, you can use them for that 1 week a year when you're doing the recovery, rather than having to pay a full backup and recovery admin to sit in the office and use them once a quarter to do a restore.
Yeah, and so that makes a massive benefit, doesn't it? I think utilizing the skills, I think, is a key thing. We've been looking at things in other areas, because we've done a lot of work towards moving towards more service delivery rather than selling products and services. And one area we're doing quite a lot of work in is around Kubernetes and looking at that container world that people are doing. And we see a large number of people are actually trying it and doing a small amount of it, but they hit about 5 nodes and they stop at that point. And it's usually because of skills, because there aren't the people out there available to do it. And I think that also comes into the backup recovery side of things. The people don't have those skills, or they can't afford them. And also, like I said before, people become more generalists. I think the advent of hypervisors and virtualization, that's driven people towards that, because most people are operating all their infrastructure through the hypervisor. They don't have any real specializations in that infrastructure itself and the storage and things. It tends to be driven through that hypervisor layer. And it does create this situation where people become more generalist and they don't have those deep skills and experiences that they can utilize for it. It's been great having you on board today and going through things. It'd be great to have you back, because I know we've got other areas we need to talk about, and it'd be great to do maybe some demos in the future and show people the kind of stuff we can do. But quickly, just we've got 2 minutes left. We talked earlier about another area, which was the protection of Office 365 type environments. One thing I know is that a lot of people make an assumption that the data is backed up by the provider. So Microsoft giving Office 365, they make this assumption that they're backing up the data. From my perspective, I know they look after the infrastructure and they're protecting the infrastructure, but there is also options where data can be corrupted, can be accidentally deleted, and other things. So, give us a couple of key benefits you think that Office 365 cloud protection delivers to an organization.
The very first one is a true backup of your data. You wouldn't expect Microsoft to back up an on-premise Exchange for you. So why do you expect them to do it when it's in the cloud? That is absolutely the first common misconception. Having that data then reside outside of Azure is also a key benefit. People have second sites for a reason. They have geographically separate locations for a reason. Taking that data out of Azure and putting it in AWS. So if the worst should happen, you still have a copy of your data to move to G Suite, to move to an alternate location, to move back on-prem to Exchange. Having that flexibility just gives you complete peace of mind that your data is not all with Microsoft.
Yeah. Well, thanks ever so much today. Like I said, we just run out of time. It was great having you aboard, like I said before, and I'd love to get you back in the future to tell us a little bit more, especially in a little bit more depth in key areas. So thanks ever so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Anytime.
Thanks a lot. Bye.